Welcome back to 50 Days to Rebuild, the series where I do 50 minutes of exercise and read 50 pages of a physio book in a day. This is day 20. Jumping into the exercises and specifically the bird dog. Again, I had some difficulties today, but overall I'd say it was pretty good. I didn't get as much SI joint pain afterwards. To clarify here, the bird dog of any nature seems to relieve the SI joint pain, but when it goes better, it relieves more of the pain. And I'd say it relieved more of the pain. And in general, I felt like I was more stable, getting a better idea of how to sort of keep my hips and spine in the same position. Not perfect, but I'd say overall it went better. Still really struggle with the shoulder portion, and I noticed, particularly on the right side, my rotor cuff felt absolutely cooked, and there was nothing akin to that on the left side whatsoever, which has me very confused as to sort of what's happening, if that's a cueing issue, or if it's just because my right shoulder and upper back is generally where the issues have stemmed from. So I guess things like issues might present asymmetrically as well. With the hip hinge, I think it went pretty well. At first I was thinking this was maintaining neutral, and then I was going, oh, maybe it's coming into a bit of flexion toward the very bottom. But I felt like I repeated that and it went all right. And then I tried to come back up to the standing variant, which I hadn't tried before. That was so hard. Like, my glutes felt like they were shaking, but it felt good. I will note though that with the hip hinge I was doing previously, I reread some of that portion and sort of flipped back to that McGill book, and I'm doing it incorrectly. I'm plantar flexing my ankles. So I'm sort of sitting on my heels but not having my toes planted, and I need to plant my toes, which makes a lot of sense because I'm feeling like I have to keep my knees touching, like my thighs sort of strapped to each other to get that glute squeeze without having my whole knees just like shoot out laterally. The moment I sort of spread them, it's like hard to squeeze and not just have that movement occur. But I did test it afterwards, and it's like the moment that you actually sit on your toes a bit with it, you have some other form of leverage to get that external rotation torque from. Glute bridge was much the same. It's a few sets of this is really hard, followed by, oh, I think I'm doing it right. So I don't know what that is, if it's just the fact that it's such a deeply problematic motor pattern, but it's going all right. I did give the wall roll a go. It was a bit difficult for me to determine whether I was getting any sort of differential movement between the pelvis and the rib cage. I did record it, but that I accidentally have deleted quite a bit of footage today, unfortunately. But I'll try that again tomorrow, and then hopefully I can see whether or not that's sort of something where I'm maintaining neutral and a sort of locked down ribcage to pelvis, or if it's just a hot mess and I need to figure out how to cue it differently. In terms of what I learned today, I'm actually quite excited. I continued reading Facilitated Stretching, which is about proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation, or PNF. It covered basically a bunch of different assessment techniques. I'm really happy with this because the previous book sounded like it was like, well, jump into this stretch if this is the issue, and I'm sort of like, how do I know that's the issue? And this seems to be covering that a bit. I will say I'm taking it with a large grain of salt because one of the assessment techniques I'd seen before, I'm like, this I'm pretty sure is well validated, and then another one that I saw, I'd literally just read McGill saying this isn't valid but people really stand by it. Or, oh no, Your Spine, Your Yoga as well, I think, was saying the same thing, that you can't use the height of your ilias, so your hip bones, to determine if there's asymmetry. Like, there might be a natural asymmetry in terms of the actual height of the bone. It might not be like some sort of compensation. That being said, there were a bunch of techniques and I ran through the normal ranges for them, which I was pretty happy with. So to start with the hamstrings, it recommended just laying supine on the back, doing a straight leg extension, and you want to get to about 90 degrees of flexion was about the normal range apparently. It doesn't specify with basically any of these stretches here, but I think the key thing and the assessment tool, is to try and keep a neutral spine when doing this, because it would be easy to sort of roll and flatten the back and sort of cheat the range. Now, before I jump into the other assessments, just generally speaking, most of the assessments and the stretches, like the PNF approach, were kind of the same thing. Some were different, but for the hamstring one, for example, it was like, oh, we'll just come up to that range and then run through the contract relax drill through that range repeatedly. And then hopefully you get more range. So yeah, very simple approach. For the quads, there were 2 tests given. So one was just sitting with the legs dangling off like a table or something and trying to extend the knee. They said you want to get to about 0 degrees or a little bit of hyperextension, and more importantly, that it was like a smooth movement. The other one was if you were laying prone, just trying to get your heel to your butt. They said you might need a little bit of help to get there, like someone giving like a bit of a passive press, but it should be close. And then it could just, if it's not getting there, it's suggesting the quad's probably tight. For the psoas and iliacus, it was a modified Thomas test. I'm not sure why it was modified, but essentially it's you're laying supine on a bench and you have one or both legs sort of hanging off at the knee, and then you're pulling the other knee to your chest. Now they said that if the leg that you didn't lift starts coming up, that's probably like a tight iliacus or psoas, and if the leg that you didn't lift starts straightening, that's probably a tight TFL or quadratus femoris. With the lower limb, it was pretty simple testing. It's sort of just actively pushing into the range and knowing what's normal is meant to be. So for example, apparently dorsiflexion, you should have about 20 degrees up and about 50 degrees of plantar flexion. It was interesting because this was the test both for the tibialis anterior and for the gastrocnemius and for the soleus, even though they're on opposing sides. So this one seems more like they can't necessarily identify specifically which one's the issue, but it's something in that space. Once it got to the gastroc on the soleus though, they said then test by going prone, bending the knee to 90 degrees so that you put the gastroc on slack, and then trying to do the different range. They said that if it's still limited at that point, that's a soleus issue, whereas if it got better, that's a gastrocnemius issue. With the peroneal muscles, so the muscles on the side of the leg, and the tibialis posterior, which is apparently the main inverter, this is again very simple way of looking at it, just inversion and eversion. So apparently we have about 20 degrees of eversion and about 45 degrees of inversion. And again, for all of these lower leg ones, it was pretty much just run through those ranges with a PNF stretch of that test. The adductors was the first point that we started to get some more complexity. They broke it down into the long and the short adductors. The test was just laying supine with the legs abducted, and they said bilaterally you want about 50 degrees in each leg. In terms of how they were addressing this, there were 2 approaches for the self stretch. One was kind of like a classic like frog type of stretch, and the other one was almost like, I guess, a side squat you might call it. For the abductors, basically just side lying, knees flexed with the upper knee behind the lower knee, and then if that range wasn't possible to get into, we had some sort of abductor limitation. The piriformis was a strange one. It was the only one that was sort of saying that excessive range would be an indicator that it was tight, which I didn't quite follow. It said that anything beyond about 45 degrees of external rotation would be that that side might be tight. It also gave a really interesting sort of rationale for why you might be experiencing piriformis syndrome of sciatica, which is overpronation in the foot, and then the piriformis is sort of fighting to right that. For the piriformis, it was pretty much like the most classic type of glute stretch you'll ever see. So bringing one heel up behind the other knee and just bringing that knee to your chest. Now for the shoulder, there were a bunch of normal ranges listed. I think I'll just try and show them on the screen because there was quite a few. For the subscapularis, which is a big internal rotator, basically the stretch for this was just against a wall, having the elbow bent to about 90 degrees and sort of pulling against it on that wall there. What they said here for the internal and external rotators, so was working on the subscap, so a big internal rotator, would improve external rotation capacity, whereas working on like the teres minor and infraspinatus, so the external rotators, would help the internal rotation, which I found interesting that the opposite function would be improved. The stretch for the teres minor and infraspinatus looked very much so like the bully stretch from Kelly's Tourette, so like that a cop would put somebody into to just restrain them. So sort of like behind the back, internally rotated, extended into grabbing like a doorknob or like the wall of some nature and sort of stepping forward. Now working on the pec major was meant to improve just a ridiculous amount of ranges of motion. So for example, horizontal abduction, flexion, extension, and external rotation. That they did say this was sort of dependent on which fibers you got involved. Now the stretch for this was definitely the most classic stretch of any I've seen, just like a wall stretch with the arm abducted to 90 degrees and the elbow flexed. They said that if you sort of raise and lower the elbow a bit, you'll start to hit some of the different fibers. The last thing in here that was covered was just around the elbow, so saying that we want about 0 degrees of extension and about 150 degrees of flexion. And they showed a very strange biceps stretch. It was kind of like a sync mobilization from Kelly Starrett, but basically you would find like a bench, sort of internally rotate your arm, I guess, and put your fist on top of the bench and then sort of squat down to get a stretch through that bicep. Now this is just for specific muscles. They also covered doing it for certain spiral patterns. So they said there's about 4 basic diagonal patterns that the body goes through. So the first one for the arm, they sort of colloquially called the self-feed into the reverse push-up. So the self-feed is flexion, horizontal adduction, and external rotation, with its opposing action being this reverse push-up, which is extension, abduction, and internal rotation. D2 was the second arm pattern, which was sheathing and drawing a sword. So drawing the sword being flexion, abduction, and external rotation, whereas sheathing the sword being internal rotation, adduction, and extension. Now the legs also had 2 patterns. So D1 for the leg was between a toe off and a soccer kick. So this soccer kick is flexion, abduction, external rotation with dorsiflexion, inversion, and extension of the toes. Quite in depth. Now the toe off position would just be the opposite of that. So we get flexion, abduction, internal rotation, plantar flexion, and flexion of the toes. Now the D2 pattern they called the snow plow to the turnout. So this is flexion, abduction, and internal rotation with a dorsiflexed and everted foot and extended toes. And the opposing motion here would be extension, abduction, and external rotation with the foot plantar flexed, inverted, and flexed toes. I know this is a very complicated pattern by words, but I guess playing that out visually, it made a fair bit of sense. Basically, same idea with most of those original PNF stretches. It was basically just working through those diagonal lines, but making sure we weren't overemphasizing one of the ranges, that we had a balance between, say, the flexion/extension, the adduction, abduction, and the rotation. And yeah, that's about it for day 20. There was a lot of different assessment stuff covered, hoping to sort of run through all of that on myself and get a bit of an idea for where I'm lacking. And yeah, that's about it, and thanks for watching. Cheers.